For the first time that night, Martin Clamp looked visibly deflated. His shoulders had slumped, and quite suddenly he was pale, and gave the impression of a youth who wasn't so sure of himself any more. He sat down on the nearest chair to him and blankly stared forward. Gary came from where he was behind the bar and walked towards Martin at pace. He stood in front of Clamp and asked what they were going to do next. He then leant down and seemed to whisper something in Martin's ear. Clamp took a deep breath and gently took the bottle of whisky from Hopkins' right hand. Clamp then downed the remainder of the bottle. He somewhat wearily rose to his feet and directed a stare at Elaine. She could detect not a hint of emotion as the moment lingered. The silence was shattered as Clamp then savagely smashed the bottle into the side of Hopkins' face and head, flooring him. Gasps of shock filled the room. Even Malvern was horrified by what he had just witnessed. However, as if completely detached from the utterly brutal act he had just committed, Clamp then made an offer to the room which any sane person would rightly see as unbelievable. "Hey guys, let's play Truth or Dare. What do you say, boys and girls? Come on, folks, it'll be like old times." Ben was pacing outside. He had thought maybe he should go inside and see if everything was okay. The sound of breaking glass is not something that can be easily ignored. But he was fearful of how Martin would react. This is a man who had slapped him around something fierce on more than one occasion. Once he had kicked the crap out of Ben for buying the wrong brand of smokes, but he had learned that anything could send him into a violent rage. Anything. Ben knew there would be big trouble as soon as Martin acquired that gun of his. He had already robbed 2 local drug dealers with it, and he had used it just to scare the shit out of some elderly Muslim bloke. Why? With Martin, maybe the question why was a useless one. Why does a nutcase do anything? Ben hadn't seen or heard the approach of the armed police officer. He was on top of him before he had a chance to think. He was ordered to lie face down on the ground and put his hands behind his head. Ben was frozen, his eyes wide and his mouth agape. The cop quickly kicked his legs from under him. In a second, Ben was face down on the cold concrete with a knee in his back. His hands were then bound up, and he was told to lie perfectly still. He tried to make a noise, but nothing came out. "Well, this being my house, I'll be asking the questions and choosing the participants," said Martin. "So first up is Gary. Truth or dare, mate?" Gary had regained consciousness, but was still on the floor and appeared to be dazed and confused. He was bleeding quite heavily. Martin called Gary a spoil sport for not taking part and directed his attention to Daniel. "Damn the man, truth or dare?" Daniel was frightened, of course, but he felt it best to play along. "Truth, I suppose," he managed to bravely say. "Okay, fair enough," declared Clamp. "Are you a dirty pillow biter?" "Oh, no, wait, let me rephrase that. Do you take it up the shitter? Are you an AIDS monkey?" Daniel couldn't answer Martin. His ability to speak had abandoned him. Much to the shock and surprise of the group, Rebecca jumped out of her seat and launched into a tirade against her captor. "Fuck you, Martin Clamp, you contemptible low-life pond scum. You think you're better than Dan? He's worth 10 of you. Everyone here is. Do everyone here a favour. Do yourself a favour. Put that thing in your mouth and pull the bastard trigger." Sean Malvern appeared to be by this time on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He wanted to run for the exit, but knew he couldn't. Martin Clamp gave brave Rebecca the death stare. She was unable to move. He raised his gun and took aim at her head. She closed her eyes and could see only Joanne. Only 1 bullet would be fired that night, only 1 fatality. The police marksman had hit Clamp in his left temple. he had fallen unnaturally. Blood gushed freely. A dark red pool spread across the polished wooden floor. Alison let out a primal scream, and almost immediately the armed response unit burst into the club. Malvern and Hopkins were cuffed and dragged away as the room filled up with masked men. This distasteful reunion had been unceremoniously halted. Charlotte couldn't remember how she had gotten outside or why she was stood alone. She couldn't remember the questions she had been asked or the answers she had given. She wouldn't have been able to tell you the time of day if her life depended on it. She felt numb. The potent mixture of emotions had stopped, but somehow her mind was still ticking over. For some reason, she could now only think of one thing. She really fancied a Chinese. Elaine saw them take the body of Martin Clamp away, but for some reason it hadn't registered with her that he was in fact dead. The feeling of dread, the fear of imminent violence against her person was still present. She offered a shoulder to cry on for Rebecca, who was in floods of tears. She had completely broken down as soon as the police had moved the group outside. Elaine envied Rebecca. She wished she could just let it all go. She wanted to fall to her knees and scream out, but she just couldn't. Elaine lit a cigarette and looked for Steve amid all the chaos. He was stood with Alex and Daniel. A young female police officer was questioning Alex, who seemed very talkative and on edge. Daniel was somewhat more withdrawn. A rage was burning inside of him. But at the same time he was consumed by a sense of satisfaction. He was glad that Martin Clamp had perished. The best kind of psycho was a dead one, as far as he was concerned. He didn't really give a shit about Hopkins or Malvern. He only wished Clamp could have suffered more. Elaine and Steve embraced. He kissed her hard on the cheek and rubbed her back as he loudly exhaled. He then looked down into her soulful eyes. He could see that she was still in the club. She was still a hostage trying to fight through a cocktail of powerful emotions. Steve felt like bursting into tears, but his pride would not allow for a public breakdown. He wanted to be somewhere private. He wanted Elaine to be with him. He wanted to be there for her when the shock wore off. Amy was sat in the front of a police car giving a statement about the night's events. She was, of course, the one who had sounded the alarm. She had never been falsely imprisoned before, but she had dealt with many horrors and had seen death at close quarters many a time before. She was handling this terrible episode better than the rest of the group. She was aware, perhaps more than any of the others, that the emotional roller coaster was far from over. A person has to go through stages of recovery when they are victimized or traumatized in such a way. Paul and Alison had not spoken to each other since they had been moved outside. They had been questioned separately, but now sat together. Alison was still weeping softly. Paul could not offer her any comfort, and he didn't know why. His brain was trying to process what had just happened, but he wasn't quite able to. He had told a paramedic that he just wanted to go home to bed, but he was told that he had a concussion and it was best he remain conscious. He had a headache, the likes of which he hadn't suffered since he was kicked in the face by one of Port Vale's central defenders almost 10 years ago. Sophia and Gillian were both in the same boat. Both had suffered a panic attack moments after the cops had stormed the club. Gillian had tried to run away from the scene but had been caught by a police officer and talked down somewhat. Sophia had curled up into a ball on the pavement. She was hyperventilating for several minutes. A paramedic had managed to talk her down. Now both Sophia and Gillian were in the back of an ambulance, sat next to each other, talking about their partners and how this was going to be very difficult to explain. Joanne had lost consciousness as they brought her out of the club. She had been put on a stretcher and they put her in the back of an ambulance. When she came around, they gave her some oxygen and tried to ask her some basic questions, like her name and where she lived. She had lost several hours. She could not understand why she was in the back of this ambulance. Had I had an accident? Did I fall down the stairs? Have I had a heart attack? Such questions came to her. She had no answers. Gary Hopkins had been rushed to hospital and put on life support. He had lost a lot of blood. He would most likely make it. A heavy prison sentence awaited him. Sean Malvern was in a bad place. He would try to give the cops the old Stonewall routine. He was labouring under the incorrect belief that this would somehow help his cause, but in truth, he was fucked. Then there was Ben. When Ben had been told that Martin was no longer in the land of the living, he had felt euphoric. He was liberated from the tyranny of an evil and insane man. No longer would he be the bitch boy. The cops were quick to figure out what kind of character Ben was. He was keen to spill the beans and throw his former comrades under the bus. This did not endear him to the authorities. Ben's happiness was to be short-lived. A cold cell awaited the coward. Charlotte got what she wanted in the end, namely some chicken fried rice and spare ribs in barbecue gravy. It was after midnight now. When asked by the girl behind the counter if she had had a nice night, Charlotte replied, "Not really, love. I think I'm done with school reunions. See you later, sweetheart."